The first time they laughed, I thought it was nothing. The second time, I realized they had already decided who I was. By the third time, I understood something dangerous. They would never take me seriously until it was too late. Before I tell you how that silence turned into something none of them could ignore, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon. Stories like this don't start loud, but they always end that way. Now let me tell you how it really began. In my family, effort was supposed to be obvious. If you weren't talking about what you were doing, showing it off, or complaining about how hard it was, then it didn't count. My uncles believed success was something you announced. My cousins thought confidence meant noise, and my parents, without meaning to, measured progress by how visible it was. I didn't work that way. Most days, I stayed quiet, not distant, focused. I spent hours thinking, learning, planning. When people asked what I was doing, I gave short answers, not because I didn't care, because every longer explanation ended the same way. A smile, a laugh, you're just playing around. At first, I tried to correct them. I explained that it mattered, that it wasn't a phase, that I had a direction. But the more serious I sounded, the less they listened. They nodded politely, then moved on to conversations they thought were more important. So I stopped explaining. Family gatherings became predictable. Someone would ask what I was up to. Before I could answer, someone else would jump in. He's always in his room. He's just experimenting. Let him enjoy himself. Enjoy himself. They said it like I wasn't building anything real, like my time didn't count because it wasn't loud enough. I learned to smile and stay quiet, not because I agreed, but because I was learning something about them. People reveal their limits when they underestimate you. The betrayal wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no clear moment where everything broke. It was subtle. My opinions weren't asked for. Decisions about my future were discussed without me in the room. Plans were made as if my role was already decided. Small, safe, dependent. I heard things I wasn't meant to hear. Conversations where my name was mentioned casually, like a detail that didn't matter much. They talked about what I'd probably do one day, what I'd likely need help with, what I wouldn't be able to handle on my own. That hurt more than laughter ever did. But I didn't react. I listened. Silence became my advantage. When people think you're not serious, they stop guarding their words. They say what they really believe. And what they believed was that I didn't matter enough to be included in real conversations. That knowledge changed how I worked. I stopped needing approval. I stopped hoping someone would notice effort early. I focused on finishing what I started, on understanding things deeply instead of performing progress for an audience. The funny thing was, the more they dismissed me, the easier it became to concentrate. No pressure, no expectations, no interruptions disguised as advice. Time passed. Weeks blurred into months. The jokes didn't change. Still playing around, having fun with that little project? I nodded every time. Inside, I was counting milestones they couldn't see. One evening, after dinner, I walked past a room and overheard a conversation that stayed with me. Two relatives were talking about the future, my future. They weren't angry or cruel. They were comfortable. Comfortable assuming. They spoke like my path was already set, limited, controlled, dependent on their help. They didn't ask if that's what I wanted. They didn't wonder if they were wrong. That was the moment I stopped feeling confused. I wasn't being ignored by accident. I was being managed. And that realization didn't make me angry. It made me calm. Because once you see the pattern, you stop taking it personally. You start planning. I understood then that proving myself too early would only confirm their control. They would explain my success away, claim credit, adjust the story so they were still right. So I waited. I stayed quiet at dinners. I let jokes land. I let assumptions grow comfortable. Every time someone laughed, it reminded me why timing mattered. They thought silence meant confusion. They thought patience meant fear. They thought I was playing. What they didn't know was that silence was discipline. The day everything shifted didn't come with warning signs. No arguments, no raised voices, just another gathering, another table, another round of familiar faces. I walked in the same way I always did. Calm, unnoticed, underestimated. They didn't know that by the end of that day, the story they'd been telling about me would collapse. and the truth they were about to learn wouldn't come from my mouth. It would come from someone they couldn't ignore. And that was when everything finally began to change. Nothing happened all at once. That's the part people never understand. There was no dramatic announcement, no confrontation where I finally stood up for myself. The shift started quietly, the same way everything else had, with people talking around me instead of to me. At the next family gathering, the jokes continued. Someone asked if I was still working on my little thing. Another laughed and said I'd probably grow out of it. I smiled, nodded, and took my seat like always. Inside, I wasn't nervous. I wasn't excited either. I was focused, because something was already in motion. What my family didn't know was that weeks earlier, someone outside this circle had started paying attention. Someone who didn't see me as a kid playing around, but as someone worth listening to. That person didn't care how loud I was at dinner or how impressive I sounded in casual conversation. They cared about consistency, about follow-through, about whether I did what I said I would do when no one was watching, and I did. That relationship grew quietly. No one in my family knew about it because no one asked the right questions. They were too busy deciding what my future looked like to notice that it was already changing. The betrayal became clearer in the days that followed. My parents began discussing plans for me without including me, where I should go, what would be realistic, what would be
safe. They framed it as concern, but I could hear the assumption underneath it, that I needed guidance, that I couldn't be trusted to decide for myself. I listened. I didn't interrupt, because interrupting would have revealed my hand too early. One afternoon, an uncle pulled me aside and said, "You know, it's good you're having fun now. Real life hits fast." He said it kindly, like advice passed down from experience. I thanked him. Inside, I noted something important. They thought time was on their side. They believed they could redirect me whenever they wanted, that whatever I was doing now could be corrected later. They didn't realize later had already arrived. The person I've been working with asked me one simple question during a conversation. "Are you ready for people to know?" I paused before answering. "Not yet," I said. They didn't push. They respected the choice. That alone told me I was right to trust my instincts. People who rush you usually want control, not clarity. Back at home, the atmosphere stayed the same, comfortable, predictable, dismissive. It was almost surreal how little had changed on the surface while everything underneath was shifting. Then came the first crack. It happened during a casual conversation, the kind that usually drifted past me. Someone mentioned a name, a person everyone at the table respected, someone whose opinion carried weight. They spoke about them casually, admiringly. I stayed quiet, because that person knew my name too. I didn't see the connection register in anyone's mind. Why would it? In their version of reality, I wasn't connected to anyone important. I wasn't doing anything serious. I was just around. That illusion held for a while. The real test came when a family decision was being discussed openly, something that directly affected me. As usual, I wasn't asked what I thought. Plans were made assuming my agreement. That was the first time I spoke up in weeks. "I won't be doing that," I said calmly. The room went quiet for a moment, then laughter followed. Not cruel, dismissive. "You'll understand later," someone said. That sentence hit differently this time, because I already understood. I didn't argue, I didn't explain, I simply repeated myself. "I won't be doing that." They looked at my parents, waiting for correction, waiting for me to be reminded of my place. It didn't come. Instead, my parents looked confused, not because they supported me, but because they weren't used to resistance from me. Silence had always been my default. Now even a small statement felt disruptive. The conversation moved on awkwardly. Something had shifted. They couldn't pretend I was completely passive anymore. Later that night, one of my cousins asked me privately what was going on, not out of concern, out of curiosity. "You've been different," they said. I shrugged. "I've been busy." They laughed. "With what?" I looked at them for a long moment, then said, "You'll see." It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. The next few weeks were strange. People watched me more closely. Questions were asked more often, but still shallow ones. No one wanted details. They wanted reassurance that nothing had changed too much. I didn't give them that reassurance. The betrayal deepened when I realized how quickly people adjusted their tone once they sensed uncertainty. Jokes became more cautious, advice more measured. They hadn't learned respect yet, but they'd learned discomfort, and discomfort is the first step towards truth. Then came the call. It was short, calm, direct. The person on the other end asked if I was ready to move forward publicly. This time, I said yes, not because I wanted revenge, but because the truth had waited long enough. I didn't tell my family right away. I let the information exist without me, managing it. That mattered. If the truth came from my mouth, they'd frame it as exaggeration or misunderstanding. If it came from someone else, they'd have to listen. The day when everything changed was supposed to be ordinary, another gathering, another meal, another round of familiar voices. I arrived the same way I always did. No announcement, no confidence performance, just calm. Halfway through the evening, a name was mentioned again, the same respected person, this time in a different context, a decision, an opportunity, and then, unexpectedly, my name followed. At first, they thought they misheard. Someone laughed. Wait, who? The name was repeated, slowly, clearly. The room went silent. Every eye turned towards me, not because I looked different, but because suddenly their version of me didn't fit the facts anymore. No one spoke, no one laughed, and for the first time, I didn't need to say a word because the truth had finally entered the room on its own.
And that silence felt heavier than every joke that came before it. For a moment, no one moved. Not a chair, not a hand, not even a nervous laugh. The kind of silence that settles when people realize they might have been wrong doesn't rush. It sits there, uncomfortable, demanding attention. Someone finally cleared their throat. "So, what does that mean?" my uncle asked, trying to sound casual. His voice was lighter than it should have been, like he was testing the ground before taking a step. I stayed quiet. That confused them more than any explanation would have. The person whose name had been mentioned, the one they respected, continued speaking, filling in details I hadn't. Not dramatically, not boastfully, just plainly, as if it was obvious, as if my involvement didn't need defending. That was the first real shock. They weren't surprised that I'd done something meaningful. They were surprised that someone important already knew. Faces changed, not all at once, but in small ways. Smiles tightened, eyebrows lifted, people leaned back in their chairs, recalculating. You could almost see the stories in their heads, rewriting themselves. My parents looked at me differently, not proud yet, not apologetic, just uncertain, like they were realizing they'd been speaking about me instead of with me for far too long. Questions followed, but carefully now. How long has this been going on? When did this start? Why didn't you say anything? Those questions revealed more than they meant to. Not curiosity, defensiveness. They weren't trying to understand me. They were trying to understand how they'd missed it. I answered simply, I tried. That was all. No accusations, no explanations, just the truth. That stung more than anger ever could. The conversation moved on, but it didn't recover. People spoke differently, less joking, more measuring. Every comment felt like it was being weighed before it left someone's mouth. That night ended early. People made excuses, said they were tired, had early mornings. They left with thoughts they didn't bring with them. I stayed behind to help clean up. Habit, routine, normality, but nothing felt normal anymore. Later, one of my parents finally asked to talk. We sat across from each other in a quiet room. No distractions, no audience. "Why didn't you tell us?" they asked. I thought about it carefully before answering. Because every time I tried, it sounded like a joke to you. They didn't argue. That silence, again, did the work for me. Over the next few days, things shifted quickly. Calls were made, conversations happened without me in the room, then with me in the room. The same relatives who'd laughed before now spoke cautiously, like they were afraid of saying the wrong thing. That change didn't feel good. It felt late. The betrayal became clearer with time. I noticed how some people tried to position themselves closer to me now, acting supportive, curious, proud. They used phrases like, "we always knew," or "I had a feeling." I didn't correct them.
People lie to protect their self-image. Letting them do that costs less than exposing it. Others reacted differently. They became distant, defensive, cold. My presence reminded them of something uncomfortable, that confidence without curiosity can blind you. Those were the ones who struggled the most. One cousin finally said it out loud. "You could have said something sooner." I looked at them and replied, "You could have listened." They didn't bring it up again. The revenge wasn't loud or dramatic. There was no moment where I confronted anyone and listed every slight. No speech, no satisfaction in watching anyone squirm. The revenge was structural. They could no longer talk about my future without me. They could no longer dismiss my time as meaningless. They had to adjust their language, their assumptions, their tone. And adjustment is exhausting when you've been comfortable for years. I watched it happen quietly. Family dynamics shifted. Advice turned into questions. Jokes disappeared. Some people genuinely tried to rebuild trust, awkwardly acknowledging that they had underestimated me. I accepted some of it. Not all, because trust isn't restored by recognition, it's restored by consistency. The person who believed in me from the beginning stayed consistent. No change in tone, no sudden pride, just the same respect they'd always shown. That mattered. It reminded me that the difference between support and control is subtle, but clear once you've experienced both. Weeks passed. The story spread beyond the family, not because I told it, but because people talk. They connect dots. They repeat things. I noticed how my name was mentioned now, with hesitation, with curiosity, with care, never with laughter. That was the real shift. One evening, I overheard a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. Again, two relatives talking quietly. "We really didn't see him," one said. "No," the other replied. "We didn't want to." That sentence settled something inside me. It wasn't ignorance, it was choice.
And that made all the difference. I realized then that silence hadn't just protected my work, it had protected my clarity. It allowed me to see who respected me only when it was convenient, and who respected me without needing proof. The secret I'd kept wasn't about what I was doing, it was about who I was becoming when no one was watching. And now that it was out, I wasn't interested in applause. I was interested in distance. Distance from assumptions, distance from control, distance from people who only value you once others do. The final shift came quietly, as most meaningful things do. A conversation where my input wasn't questioned, a decision where my voice carried weight, a moment where no one interrupted me. That's when I knew. They hadn't just learned what I was doing, they'd learned they no longer had access to who I was before. And that realization unsettled them more than any announcement ever could. After that night, nothing went back to the way it was. The house looked the same, the routines stayed familiar, but the way people spoke around me had changed. Conversations slowed when I entered a room, jokes stopped halfway through, advice came wrapped in hesitation instead of confidence. They were learning how to talk to someone they could no longer dismiss. At first, I thought that would feel satisfying, like justice, like balance being restored. But it didn't land that way. What I felt instead was distance, emotional distance, the kind that forms when you finally see people clearly and realize you don't need them to understand you anymore. Some relatives tried to reconnect in ways that felt forced. They asked questions they'd never asked before, showed interest in details they once mocked. They wanted updates, progress reports, reassurance. I gave them very little, not out of bitterness, but because I learned something important. When people only listen once your value is proven, their attention is conditional, and conditional attention always comes with expectations attached. Others stayed quiet. They didn't apologize, they didn't explain, they simply adjusted, like the truth had rearranged their internal map, and they didn't want to talk about how lost they'd been before. I respected that more. My parents took the longest to process it. They weren't cruel people, they just absorbed the same assumptions everyone else had. That seriousness looked loud, that commitment announced itself, that silence meant uncertainty. One evening, weeks later, one of them finally said, "I didn't realize how much you were carrying alone." I nodded. I didn't want to explain it anymore. They didn't push back. That mattered.
The revenge wasn't about watching anyone regret their behavior. It wasn't about seeing embarrassment or guilt. If anything, it was about watching control dissolve, watching people realize they couldn't manage my future anymore because they hadn't paid attention when it mattered. That kind of revenge is quiet. It doesn't burn, it settles. I noticed how decisions involving me changed. I was asked, not told. My opinion wasn't overridden for my own good. When plans were made, my presence was assumed, not optional. That shift wasn't dramatic, but it was permanent. The people who had once laughed didn't suddenly become villains in my story. They just became background characters. Their opinions mattered less. Their approval meant nothing. And that freedom, that was the real outcome. I kept working, quietly, focused, just like before. The difference now was internal. I wasn't hiding anymore. I simply wasn't explaining. One afternoon, a relative joked, "Guess you weren't playing around after all." I smiled politely. "No," I said. "I was preparing." They laughed awkwardly, unsure how to respond. I realized then that the story they'd told about me had collapsed completely. They didn't know where to place me anymore, and instead of trying to correct that, I let it remain undefined. Being underestimated taught me patience. Being believed taught me boundaries. I didn't need validation from people who missed the quiet version of me. That version had done the work. That version had endured the jokes, the dismissals, the small betrayals disguised as concern. That version was the reason the truth landed so hard. Looking back, I understood something clearly. If I'd spoken louder earlier, they would have interrupted. If I'd argued, they would have defended themselves. If I'd demanded respect, they would have framed me as emotional or unrealistic. Silence had removed all their defenses. It let the truth arrive without distortion. The family still gathers. We still eat at the same table. We still talk about plans and futures. But there's a line now, a quiet understanding of where my space begins and theirs ends. No one laughs when I talk about what matters to me anymore. They listen, not because I asked them to, because they learned what happens when you don't. And that lesson didn't need repeating. They thought I was just playing around. What they learned, slowly, uncomfortably, and without my help, was that some people don't announce growth. They wait, they build, and when the truth finally speaks, it doesn't ask for permission, it changes everything.